Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. The Harvard Alumni Association for Climate and the Environment is very excited to host this lecture, Climate Justice with Professor Cass Sunstein. My name is Michelle Faggart, and I'm one of the co-presidents of HACE, and we will share just a little bit about our organization before we kick it over. HACE is a volunteer-led community of Harvard alumni who are passionate about making a difference in addressing climate and the environment across the globe. And we work to connect people through a few different strategies. We hope to create connections between like-minded alumni who are passionate about climate and the environment. We hope to amplify the work of Harvard and Harvard institutions, as well as Harvard alumni working on climate education activities and actions. And we hope to further develop the wonderful leaders in the Harvard network who are making an impact across the world. We have three areas of programming. We focus on community, on education, and catalyzing and supporting action. And we are very privileged to have an amazing management committee of leaders from all different areas of the globe, from all different areas of expertise. Thank you to all of our management committee members who are joining us today. You will hear from Santiago, our other co-president, towards the end of the presentation. And finally, in addition to amazing lectures and featured speakers, such as the one we have today, there are many opportunities to become involved and to volunteer. We have climate action training and support groups. We have a monthly book club, which is phenomenal. We have many opportunities to network either in person or virtually. And we have many ways to stay connected. So if any of this sounds good to you, if you enjoy your presentation today, we very much hope that you join our network. We will share in the chat in just a moment how you can become a member of HACE and how you can stay connected with us over LinkedIn, Slack, and WhatsApp. Finally, thank you to those who support HACE and collaborate with HACE, including the Salata Institute and the Harvard Alumni Association, who have supported this event today. And with that, I will introduce Professor Sunstein. All right, Professor Sunstein is currently the Robert Walmsley University Professor at Harvard. He is the founder and director of the program on behavioral economics and public policy at Harvard Law School. In 2020, the World Health Organization appointed him as chair of its technical advisory group on behavioral insights and sciences for health. From 2009 to 2012, he was administrator of the White House Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, and after that, he served on the President's Review Board on Intelligence and Communications Technologies. Professor Sunstein has testified before congressional committees on many subjects, and he has advised officials at the United Nations, the European Commission, the World Bank, and many nations on issues of law and public policy. Professor Sunstein is the author of hundreds of articles and dozens of books, but today we will focus on his most recent release, Climate Justice, What Rich Nations Owe the World and the Future. And we will have a quick lecture followed by some Q&A. So as Professor Sunstein is going through his presentation, please submit all questions through the question and answer function, which you should follow at the bottom of the screen. So without further ado, I will begin sharing my screen again and turn it over.
Okay. It's a pleasure and an honor to get to speak to you. Thank you for being here. There's the title, and there's a scene of something which is not ideal and might be a product of injustice. Next slide. I was thinking that I maybe would have been more well advised to have a different title given where we are. Buying Greenland was a candidate. I could have had it be called that. That would be a different subject. Next slide. Or it could have been called Tariff Justice, which would have been, maybe consistent with the zeitgeist. But we're going to stick with climate justice. Next slide. And I don't know how many of you remember the movie 8 Mile starring Eminem, but in the key scene, Eminem, our hero, is in a rap battle. And he has a bunch of things that are vulnerabilities. And in his version of the rap battle, he basically says, yes, I am white. Yes, I am short. Yes, I did get beaten up. Yes, I live with my mom. He says everything that could be said against him. And that was a good strategy by Eminem, and we are going to try to follow his strategy. Next slide. So here's my rap battle Eminem style, though don't expect the cool factor of Eminem. The United States should follow, focus on the United States. That is the responsibility of American political officials. Domestic self-interest is the new Taylor Swift, meaning super, super popular, but actually domestic self-interest in the United States and to some extent in Europe is not just Taylor Swift. It's actually Olivia Rodrigo, who's maybe not quite as talented as Taylor Swift, but is a little bit, forgive me, Miss Swift, cooler. So next slide. There she is, and we're going to associate her with DSI, standing for domestic self-interest. I'm not sure Ms. Rodrigo would like the association. All that's meant is there's coolness, like off the charts coolness, in her and in the idea of domestic self-interest as an organizing principle for climate policy. Yes, that's kind of the thing of the day. Okay, here's the most important number you've never heard of, at least most people have never heard of. It's called the social cost of carbon. And before you fall asleep, the social cost of carbon is the defining number for climate change policy all over the world. That is how much damage is done by a ton of carbon emissions. If you think the number is really high, then you will be in favor of lots of regulation because you're stopping really high damage. If you think the number is really, really low, then you won't be in favor of a lot of steps to reduce greenhouse gas emissions because the damage that's averted is not much. It's small. So the social cost of carbon meant to capture the damage done by a ton of carbon emissions is either explicitly or implicitly a really crucial number for climate change policy in China, in Germany, in the United States, in Canada, everywhere. An inside story is when I worked in the government under President Obama, there was an effort, this is extremely public. There was an effort to come up with a social cost of carbon. I was the co-chair of the effort, and it was an extremely technical exercise. That is, it wasn't political even a little bit. The people who were involved were economists, scientists, and lawyers, and each played to their comparative advantage. It was an interagency process where the Department of Energy and the Environmental Protection Agency, the President's science advisors, the Office of Science and Technology Policy, and others participated, the Department of Transportation, the Department of Commerce, and we tried to figure out, according to the best available science and economics, consistent with law, what is the social cost of a ton of carbon emissions. And the number on which we eventually lit was approximately $50. And that was designed to capture the consensus of the existing best empirical evidence. When Obama shifted to the private sector and when Trump shifted to president, the number kind of magically went down to 2 to 6 from 50. And if you're following, that's really important to climate change policy because under President Trump, Trump 1, that is, the value of reducing carbon emissions is really little. It's not much, $2 to $6. And Obama, it's pretty big, $50. There's just one thing that marks the difference between what Obama did and Trump did. It's not the science, it's not the economics. I'm not going to spoil the surprise. I'm going to tell you pretty soon. There's just one thing that measured the difference between Obama and Trump. When Trump shifted to Biden, the presidency shifted hands. Biden said, basically, let's go back to the Obama approach, 50 in the short run. And in the long run, let's do our new analysis. involving current science and current economics. And whoosh, the Biden number went up to 190 approximately, which is basically in the domain of where scientists and economists are right now. You could think it's too high, you could think it's too low. It's not way off. So 190 from 2 to 6, that's a huge change. And 190 from 50, that's a very big change. So Biden went way up. And notice this really matters because the benefits of greenhouse gas reductions completely turn on what the number is. President Trump recently has said that we probably don't want any number at all. It's effectively going to be the equivalent of 0. And if we use a number in the interim, it should be Trump 1 number, 2 to 6. So that's the story of the most important number you've never heard of. And I'm going to try to tell you how this bears on questions of justice approximately now. Next slide. Okay, so there's a Labrador Retriever. I have a Labrador Retriever, and Labrador Retrievers have approximately nothing to do with the big debate, but we like how they look. So hello, nice Labrador Retriever. The big debate is about whether the damage done by a ton of carbon emissions in a country is the domestic damage or is the global number. That's super fundamental. So the question is, when the United States is deciding whether to scale back carbon emissions, does it think we'll deliver the amount of damage that is captured in the amount of damage done to Americans? Or do we ask instead, do we think about the amount of damage that's done by our emissions to the world? And when I said there's one thing that divides Obama from Trump, and one thing that's fundamental to the division between Biden and Trump, it's right there. Biden personally said, we're going to use the global number. The Obama administration chose to use the global number. The Trump administration now has twice said, we're going to use the domestic number. And the difference between 2 to 6 and 50 or 190 turns in large part on that one issue. And it shouldn't be obscure to see why, because the damage done by a ton of carbon emissions in the United States by, let's say, an American company is going to be some fraction of the damage done all over the world by that ton of carbon emissions. So that's completely fundamental. Next slide. Okay, here's some news from 2 courts. The Trump administration's decision to use the domestic number was struck down as arbitrary in court. So lawyers, please notice, the court said you can't just say we're going to use the domestic number, you have to explain it. The Obama administration's choice of the global number was upheld in federal court on the ground that it was adequately explained. And this is just an illustration of something super inspiring, I think, which is the commitment to reason giving built into a system committed to the rule of law. You can't do something because you want to. That's not enough. You have to say, here's why it's a good idea. And that led to validation for Obama, invalidation for Trump. That doesn't mean Obama was right and Trump was wrong. It just meant the burden of reason giving was met in one case and not in another. Next slide. Okay, so let's talk now about some common reasons to choose the global number that aren't really good reasons. So I worked in the Obama and Biden administrations. I'm going to be saying that 2 reasons given by those administrations for using the global number aren't convincing. Okay, the first reason given is we're all connected. So if there's harm done to the people of Europe, Americans are not immune. They will suffer if Europe suffers. Or if that doesn't convince you, there are Americans who live in Europe. There are Americans who live in South America. There are US citizens who live in Canada. There are US economic interests all over the world. So if there's damage done to US interests that don't involve the territorial boundaries of the United States, that's still damage done to US interests. We're all connected. That's completely fair. It suggests that we need an inclusive domestic number if we're going to use a domestic number that captures the full range of negative effects on US citizens rather than an exclusive number that disregards an assortment of effects. But then this is the reason it's unconvincing. The fact that we're all connected doesn't justify the use of the global number. Whatever the inclusive domestic number is, that includes all negative effects on US citizens, it doesn't match the global number. It has to be smaller than the global number. So that argument doesn't justify the global number. It suggests the domestic number has to be kind of bigger than we would otherwise have thought, but not the global number. Here's the second argument that I say is not convincing, offered by the Obama and Biden administrations. Economists and scientists have at least some approximations of the global damage done by climate change. It's not, like 2 + 2 = 4. It's not math, but it's pretty rigorous and pretty careful. They don't have tools to estimate the damage done in particular countries. So they're much better, more confident saying this is the global damage from climate change in 2060 than saying this is the damage to Brazil in 2060. For that reason, any judgment about the domestic damage is going to have a lot of conjecture in it. That's fair, but this is my central point. It doesn't justify use of the global number. It suggests that the domestic number will have guesswork, but whatever guesswork there is, it's going to be a fraction of the global number. So the fact that we don't know what the domestic damage is exactly maybe suggests we should have, an upper bound and be precautionary, but it doesn't get us all the way to the global number. So this suggests these two arguments both have capital P, the P word, problems. Next slide. Okay, here's a better argument for use of the global number. Let's call it moral cosmopolitanism. Every human being born in Colombia, Canada, the Central African Republic, or the United States deserves equal concern and respect. Someone born in Sudan doesn't deserve less respect than someone born in New York City. The moral cosmopolitan argument urges that every human being deserves to be treated with equal concern and respect. Now, at first glance, that argument pushes towards foreign aid. It says that helping vulnerable people is a moral imperative if wealthy countries can do that. But notice in the context of climate change, we're not calling for foreign aid when we ask to use the global number. We're asking instead not to commit foreign harm. They're not the same. You might say that for the US to give a ton of money to help poor people around the world is not morally obligatory. You might think that. Even if you think that, you ought to think if the United States is imposing harm on foreign countries, it ought to stop. If Mexico imposes pollution on Texas that results in injury to the citizens of Texas, it ought to stop and it ought to compensate Texans for the harm it's done. The global number captures exactly that judgment, that countries ought not to impose foreign harm. Hooray, I say, for no foreign harm. Also for foreign aid, I think, but that's very different. So let's have a tentative check mark next to this argument for considering the global number on the ground that it's required by justice. Next slide. Okay, the final argument for using the global number is one of reciprocity. The argument is if any country is to be protected against the harms from climate change, it must be because the world is using the global number, not the domestic number. If China uses the domestic number, and if the United States uses the domestic number, And if the Union uses the domestic number, and if Brazil and Russia use the domestic number, as Tom Hanks famously said, Houston, we have a problem. The only way to get the world in a decent situation with respect to climate change is for everyone to use the global number, because that protects everyone against the harm, which would be something like mutually assured, at least badness, if not destruction, mutually assured badness, which would result from using the domestic number. So notice, if you're following, that the reciprocity argument says the United States should use the global number, not because justice requires it, but out of domestic self-interest. If we use the domestic number, we contribute to a situation in which everyone else does, and American citizens will be hurt. So will Chinese citizens. So will citizens in Argentina and Italy. The use of the global number by the United States contributes to a situation in which everyone is using it, which protects citizens of guess which country? Everyone, but for present purposes, the United States. That's to say, domestic self-interest argues in favor of using the global number, DSI, say it loud, say it proud. It's not an airtight argument, because the United States might use the number and other countries might not. Doesn't guarantee it, but still it makes it more likely. Next slide. So where we are now is use of the global number has a moral justification to prevent harm, and also has a kind of self-interested justification to ensure solution of a collective action problem. It's a prisoner's dilemma, which this ensures, or at least increases the likelihood of solution. Now let's shift a bit to talk about who counts. You see 3 children in the picture. They're meant to be children from different places. They're also meant to be kind of adorable. I think they are. Let's suppose those are kids who were born in 2040. We have a little time machine and we captured kids in 2040. Do they count less than a parallel picture of kids in 2025? The proposition is no. When you are born is not determinative of whether you have a right to be protected from harm. The fact that some of us were born in the 1970s or 80 or 90s doesn't mean that we are worth more than people who are born 70 years from now. That's the when. What about the where? The fact that some people are born in countries A and B and C doesn't mean that they're entitled to less respect, less concern than people who are born in countries X, Y, and Z. The moral irrelevance of when you're born or where you're born, this claim about justice, bears on the question whether we should help people, and also bears on the question whether we should refrain from hurting people. Okay, next slide. Okay, with respect to the future, there's a lot of debate by philosophers and economists about the discount rate. I hope you'd rather have a little bit of money today than the same amount of money in 10 years. One reason is that if you get it today, you can invest it and watch it grow. A bunch of money 10 years from now is just worth less. So to have a discount rate that reflects that is completely sensible. To have a discount rate that reflects the fact that your future self isn't you in the same way that you are currently you is a little hard to defend. So the fact that the future is the future is not a morally acceptable reason to count it less. The fact that money can be made to grow is a reason to count future money less. And then we have an engine for thinking about climate change investments. All we want to think about is investment, not about the moral irrelevance of future persons. Next slide. Okay, let's talk about corrective justice, shall we? If a nation, call it, what should we call it? Canada. The United States White House seems a little mad at Canada. I love Canada, but let's be a little mad at Canada. Sorry, Canadians, for just for the moment. Bear with me. If Canadians do something that harms people in Vermont and New Hampshire, on corrective justice grounds, Canada ought to stop and it ought to pay those who are hurt. So the general tort idea has a corrective justice element, which is those who harm others should stop and should pay. That's an intuition. It applies for individual behavior, for corporate behavior. And if you're with me, we can think about this as applying to nations as well. Corrective justice as a reason that nations that have been hurt by greenhouse gas emissions have a claim on nations who have hurt them to stop and to help. That's the first point. Next slide. Then there's a point about distributive justice, which suggests that those who are, really well off ought to be helping those who aren't so well off. And one reason is kind of very hard-headed, and one is soft-hearted. The hard-headed reason is, let's just stipulate that these three kids are really poor. If I lost $200, I wouldn't like it very much. That wouldn't be a great thing. But if those kids are poor and if each of them got $66 and a little bit, then that would be a really big deal for them. So if you distribute resources from rich people to poor people, you don't only increase equality, you also increase welfare. So that's the hard-headed reason, that welfare goes up if those who have plenty give to those who have nothing or nearly nothing. The soft-hearted reason is, look, people are really suffering. And if people who aren't suffering can help those who are suffering, they really should. That's a claim about distributive justice. Next slide. Okay, so brass tacks. Who's contributed most to climate change? In the history of our species, this is knowable. It's my beloved country. We have contributed the most to climate change. A fact. On an annual basis, in terms of the flow of greenhouse gas emissions, China is the world champion. Annual basis, China's way ahead of the United States. Total stock, the United States remains well ahead of China. So let's just take those as foundations. Who's the most vulnerable to China climate change? Not Denmark, not Sweden, not Canada, and not the United States. Okay, there's something kind of like a bright burst of sunlight and like a justification for tears in this slide, I think, where those who have contributed most to the climate change problem are not those who are most vulnerable to it. So those who have made it the problem that it is are not principally at risk, either because they have resilience built into their systems or because they're not so dependent on agriculture. So take that as a searing fact, which relates to the next slide. Okay, from the standpoint of harm, countries like the one here, I think it's Pakistan, are not principal contributors to climate change, but are disproportionately at risk. Next slide. And then we'd say, from the facts just described to the conclusion, if one person harms another, we know what corrective justice requires. If the person who harms another is super rich and the person who's harmed isn't, then there's a distributive justice complement to the corrective justice idea. And then we just go to the nation state case and think, what does morality require there? And that's not meant to be a really hard question. Help. It requires help. Ceasing or reducing, it requires that too. Next slide. Okay, we could complicate this. And I confess, when I originally did this book, the complications were front and center. They're really fussy points. And I got to the conclusion I'm giving you, kicking and screaming. I didn't want to get to the conclusion that justice requires the wealthy countries to help the poor countries most vulnerable. I'm an American. I have high hopes for my country, the idea that we would be morally obliged to spend significant expenditures to help other countries. That's my conclusion, but it wasn't one that I was entirely happy to reach. But here are the complications. Who's the wrongdoer exactly? My parents didn't intend to hurt anyone anywhere when they used electricity or had high polluting cars. My grandparents certainly didn't. Are they wrongdoers? They're innocents. The Americans who've contributed to greenhouse gas emissions didn't have the state of mind that tort law sometimes requires, not intention, maybe not even knowledge. Who's the victim exactly? Some people in countries that are pretty vulnerable are pretty wealthy and pretty resilient. So there are people in poor countries who aren't at all poor and who are in pretty good shape to withstand climate risks. And what about the benefits? Wealthy countries have imposed risks, but they've also created, extraordinary technological and economic benefits for poor countries. It might be laptops, it might be a GPS device, it might be cell phones. Those come from wealthy countries. Shouldn't the benefits that the wealthy countries have conferred be subtracted from the costs if we're doing an accounting? So these are three sets of complications over which the book worries a lot. Next slide. But I think what we want to say about the fussy points is what the Beatles used to sing, especially in their iconic song, and I hope you all know it. She loves you. Do you know what words follow? She loves you. Dramatic pause. Are you getting scared? I'm going to try to sing. I'm not going to try to sing, but you can see the four-letter words that follow she loves you. Now, those are said with a kind of exuberance. In this context, it's yeah, meaning it's right, but it doesn't undermine the fundamental point. They're fussy, legitimate concerns, but they do not undermine the fundamental points. Next slide. And if you haven't seen A Complete Unknown, starring one of the very few artists who's better than the Beatles, Bob Dylan, please see the movie A Complete Unknown. And do you know what's coming? Next slide. Hard Rain. That's one of his great songs. And I'm seeking to tell a tale in praise of rough justice, where rough justice calls for reduction in emissions and compensation for those who are at risk. I'm not putting numbers on any of those, but I'm saying the moral point is clear. Next slide. Okay, concretely, mitigation, reduced emissions, the social cost of carbon will help for that and help with adaptation and resilience. There's a program, by the way, in the United States called the BRIC program, which was created by the Trump administration first round, which was just for the US, but it was to give resources to communities who are at risk from weather-related events. And it was a great program. The Biden administration made it bigger and bigger. Regrettably, the Trump administration has eliminated it. But there are BRIC program analogs all over the world in which countries are using their own resources or their help from other countries to become more resilient. And if the arguments thus far are not entirely off the mark, the resources to help out there are morally obligatory. Next slide. Okay, so we're just about done. 5 conclusions, a cluttered slide, but 5 simple conclusions. First is the global number is the right one for the social cost of carbon. It's probably the legally required one also. It's justified on moral grounds and also on grounds of reciprocity. Future people count equally. Your grandchildren do not count less than you do. I hope you have grandchildren in the fullness of time. I hope I have grandchildren in the fullness of time. They count equally. We discount future benefits and costs, but not because future people are worth less, but because current money is worth more than future money. People in other countries count. They are not morally irrelevant, especially if we have harmed them. So the modest argument is that if we have harmed them, we should stop and help them. But there's a kind of more sweeping point in the background is that it's really good to have friends. It's good to have friends partly because it's a tribute to the character of the person or entity that has friends that it does. And it's kind of right to have good character. It's also true that, as my mother said to me frequently, you reap what you sow. So having good friends helps you in times of vulnerability. So we're going to end with a mildly emotional slide. Next slide. Not that one, this one. That's a slide of friends. The one in the middle is the last administrator of the U.S. Of USAID, the Agency for International Development, which was all over the moral and strategic issues that I'm discussing. USAID was the United States' principal wielder of soft power, animated by both moral concerns and a thought that it's good to have friends. And the last administrator, it looks like for a while, maybe forever, of USAID is the woman in the middle, and that's my wife, Samantha Power. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Sunstein, for this wonderful presentation. And as many of you might know, this is the inaugural lecture for the Earth Day month from Harvard Alumni for Climate and the Environment. So we're really happy to have you as the inaugural lecturer for this talk. And we have some questions from HACE members from the audience. So if you allow me, we will start with the first one. And this question says, from your research and practical experience at Harvard, what are the most affordable and scalable strategies or technologies currently available to implement eco-friendly transportation and industrialization in low-income and developing countries while ensuring minimal carbon footprint and maximum community benefit? Furthermore, how can institutions collaborate with Harvard to pilot such solutions globally?
It's a
Thank you.
fantastic question. It's well beyond my expertise. So the social cost of carbon is an issue on which I've worked a great deal. The issues of justice also I have something to say about. On what technologies are best, I would defer to those who are specialists in that area.
Thank you. Another one. So when are we going to establish right to healthy environment globally?
Well, let me say something controversial, shall I? Which is that I'm not sure we ought to establish a right to a health environment globally. And the reason is it's not clear what good that would do. So to have strong environmental protection designed to ensure that water is clean and air is breathable, that's a really good idea. To establish a right to a healthy environment, that's expressive and aspirational, but what good will it do? In the United States, we have a Clean Air Act, which has been spectacularly successful at making the air cleaner. And what it does is it establishes an assortment of regulatory requirements designed to ensure that the air is clean. So it says requisite to protect the public health with an adequate margin of safety. I'm concerned that abstract rights might be a way of making people feel good without doing anything. But I do want to be cautious about that. If the establishment of a right to a healthy environment in international documents or something is a background fact against which concretized things happen, then it could be a good thing.
Thank you. We have another one. Do you see any pathways towards this picture of justice through the U.S. justice system along the lines of the now ended Juliana versus United States or otherwise?
I think the best way to do it is through the legislature and through the executive branch. So the choice of the social cost of carbon is been the global number has been the dominant choice of the executive branch over the last years. It was not chosen by the Trump administration. That was struck down in court. So the executive should choose the global number. To have the courts do it through a check on arbitrary decision making, that's fine and a good thing. To have it happen through the courts otherwise, I'd be very cautious about, on the ground that the courts lack the democratic accountability and the policy making expertise to be the engine for this. And the same thing would be said about um, uh, helping poor nations adapt so that the harm done isn't as severe as it would otherwise be. To have the courts doing that probably would be not so likely, and it would be far from ideal.
Okay. Then we have another one. What discount rate is appropriate? Our investor-owned utilities assert their cost of capital.
2.6%.
Okay. How do we realistically get to a place where the social cost of carbon becomes the global number carbon tax, especially when each political administration is changing the SEC, to your point?
Okay, so there's carbon taxes and then there's regulatory decision making. Let's talk first about regulatory decision making. All over the world, there are institutions that are reducing emissions, either a little bit or a lot. And when they choose how much to do, a social cost of carbon is either an explicit or an implicit part of their decision making. So to use social cost of carbon is now pretty familiar, and to use either the domestic or global number is also pretty familiar. My understanding is that in nations that are explicit about it, the global number is really the popular one. Someone on the call can correct me if I'm wrong, but aside from the United States, I'm not aware of any nation that has explicitly chosen the domestic one. That's instructive. To have UN processes be explicitly attuned to the social cost of carbon and show a consensus on the global number, that would be in the world's interest, would be in the domestic interest of those who agreed to that. A carbon tax, great point. It's extremely challenging. So in many nations, France is maybe the most salient, the idea of a carbon tax runs into significant political resistance. If you can't get a carbon tax, and there are good reasons to think a carbon tax would be an excellent idea, but if you can't get a carbon tax, to build a social cost of carbon into regulatory decision making is a good alternative.
Okay. There's another one that relates to this, and it says, in your opinion, what facets of the SEC still require research, or is it now more of an implementation question?
That's a great question. So implementation today of a reasonable number would be a big step forward. And 50 is reasonable but low. 190, last I checked, was reasonable but high. So if countries are in that vicinity, we have a major step forward. And the haggling between 60 and 80, let's say, is a matter of relative detail. Everything continues to need research. So one question is, what is the climate sensitivity? So if you get more greenhouse gas emissions, how sensitive to the climate is the climate to a given unit of increase in greenhouse gas emissions? There's not a consensus on that. Then another question is what damage is done by a certain amount of change in the climate. And that also we don't know nearly enough about. So there are some things we just have a lack of information. We can't specify, and there are other things where we have a range of possibilities. So the science and the economics need to keep coming. And there are some good analysts who think that there's a ton of guesswork in the best existing research. Robert Pindick at MIT, who I think is excellent, thinks that this is all very conjectural. My view is that he overstates the level of conjecture, and also as a practical matter, to dismiss findings that are conjectural is not in the world's interest. We use the best conjecture we get. We do that every day. But Pindick's skepticism about the social cost of carbon evidence base, let's call it, is instructive about the need for continued scientific and economic work.
Thank you. We have one more here. It says, while it's true that our grandparents lacked the mens rea to be the wrongdoers, as you say, there are parties who intended harm and still do, specifically the fossil fuel industry and their protectors. How do they figure into this argument?
If they say, I don't think the fossil fuel companies intend harm. So, those who run coal-fired power plants aren't thinking, hooray, I'm causing harm. So they might think, I don't believe it. They might think, yes, there's some harm done by fossil fuels in terms of climate, but look at all the benefits. You get all this clean energy. Or they might kind of be motivated in their reasoning. So they might think, at some level, I get there's a lot of science out there, but to believe it would be extremely dispiriting, so I'm not going to believe it. That's kind of motivated reasoning. I'd be a little, just in my heart, a little charitable to the fossil fuel companies and say, they've done some very bad things, but the notion that they want those bad things to occur, that would be very surprising.
Sure, thank you. Thank you, Professor Sunstein. Very thought-provoking. This is a two-part question. What are your thoughts on whether a university should officially take sides on public issues? And two, which philosophers have influenced your moral calculus when it comes to climate justice?
Thank you for that. I think the two philosophers, they're both Harvard philosophers, John Rawls, who speaks about choosing principles of justice behind a veil of ignorance, where you don't know anything about yourself. You don't know where you live. You don't know if you're male or female. You don't know if you're white or black. You don't know, how much money you have. You don't even know if you're athletic. So you know nothing about yourself. That's where you choose principles of justice. I think that's a very powerful way to think about it. And Amartya Sen, economist and philosopher at Harvard, has influenced me a lot on climate as well. I think universities should take no stands on public issues. That taking stands for universities is a terrible thing. That it leads to a committee on which nations or causes to denounce. And the benefits of that are approximately zero, and the costs are very high. So for individuals to take stands, including professors, is completely fine and maybe good. But for Princeton or Yale to take a stand is not a good thing for Princeton or Yale, and not a good thing for anybody else.
Okay. If the current US administration won't be taking up the social cost of capital, which entities are leading the way? And who would you like to see step up?
Yeah, thank you for that. That's great. State and local governments. So we all have an interest in, a clean environment and in reduced risks from climate change. And New York, in the United States, New York and California, Texas, I'm naming some big ones, Michigan, these would all be great to step up. And because the climate change problem is so large that it seems daunting, but any steps taken to reduce emissions create some domestic and global benefit. And let's lowball the social cost of carbon. Let's call it $25. That's really lower than is responsible. But if we reduce some number of tons of emissions in, let's say, Michigan, that's $25 times those tons. And that can be a very big thing to confer on the world. So states and localities, that's what we saw under the first Trump administration. And, the hope is always a good thing. So I'd like to see some nice things from the Trump administration on this count.
Okay. What do you think about the universal levy on international shipping? Will it achieve a justice component via the International Maritime Organization?
Don't know enough about that to have a view. So I'm thankful for the question and slightly embarrassed by my ignorance.
No problem. Another one on the discount rate. Why 2.6% discount rate? If that is what was said,
Okay, so the answer was a little bit of a joke. So Bob Dylan was asked in an interview, how many folk singers are there, people who are protest singers? And he said 136. And then someone said, 136, really? And he said, well, maybe 142. And I thought it was funny. It's that he didn't know. So when I said 2.6, I said it with a kind of firmness, which of course I don't feel. A 4 or 5% discount rate would be clearly too high. If you can find a risk-free investment of 4 or 5% these days, please tell me about it, because I want to invest in that. If you can't find something that's paying more than 1%, then you're not looking hard enough. So if you look at the risk-free rate of return is a good start toward the discount rate. And when I said 2.6, that was just a grasp at what the risk-free rate of return is right now. It was maybe a year ago or so in the vicinity of 2%, but their risk-free rates of return have increased. So 2.6 take us around there. Certainly lower than 2% would be very hard to defend as a discount rate, and higher than 3.5 would be very hard to defend. And what we're looking at is what is the risk-free rate of return.
Okay, thank you for your wonderful presentation. What do you think about loss and damage fund still not being functioned as it should be for the vulnerable countries?
Yeah, I think a loss and damage fund is clearly a good idea and consistent with, the book I apparently have written on climate justice. So a loss and damage fund is a very good idea. There are multiple reasons that reasonable people can disagree about how big it should be. And I don't have a view on how big it should be, but one thing's clear, not small. Now, what does that mean? $10,000. For me, that's not small, but clearly is going to be in excess of that. $500,000, that's a lot, but it's clear it's going to be more than that. What exactly it should look like, there are political constraints as well as principal disagreements, but the idea of a loss and damage fund, that's a very good idea.
Okay, and this is going to be the last question. This question regards communication framing tactics. I noticed you frame your argument in terms of domestic self-interest. What kinds of language framing do you suggest for the climate movement in the context of the current administration? Would it be useful to position climate work in terms of other social priorities to achieve traction?
Okay, that's a great question. And I don't feel comfortable with any answer. I'll just give one road into an answer. There's some super interesting work on moral foundations, which suggests that both people on the left and people on the right care about wrongdoing and harm, and they care about fairness. So if people are cheating, the left and the right think that's bad. If people are punching each other, the left and the right think that's bad. So harm and fairness are basically there's consensus on. There are three ideas that the left doesn't see very well and the right cares about. One is loyalty, one is authority, and one is purity. So if someone is disloyal to their country, the right really hates that, the left less so. If someone is kind of disgusting, the right really hates that, the left less so. And if someone is um, contemptuous of authority, the right tends to hate that, and the left might be okay with it. And to signal the connection between efforts to reduce climate change and respect for nature, respect for God, respect for tradition, those are things which resonate better with the right than certain arguments which the left is more comfortable with. And we actually have data that the moral foundations of loyalty and purity and authority in the domain of climate change can create coalitions across political lines.
Okay. Well, we are almost at time, Professor Sunstein. It's been a great honor and pleasure to have you, and we hope we have the opportunity to host you again. For the members of Harvard Alumni for Climate and the Environment, it's really an honor to have had the opportunity to hear from this new book that you have just published, and hopefully we'll have the opportunity to have you again and discuss some of the behavioral nudges to overcome this inertia in climate policy implementation that we are all facing. Thank you again. Thank you to your team for supporting us in hosting this event. We also want to recognize the Salata Institute for Climate, who co-sponsored this opportunity for all of the Harvard alumni as well as the Harvard Alumni Association. And I'll pass it on to my co-president, Michelle Fager, to close the event. Thank you. We can't hear you, Michelle.
Yeah, thanks everyone for joining. I have nothing else to say. Hope to see you soon.
Thanks, everybody.